I wanted to give everybody an opportunity, first and foremost, to just tell me your reaction to the events over the last few days, particularly Saturday morning in Tucson, Congressman.
I first met Gabby about 5 years ago. I went to Tucson, spent 2 days with her, got to know her very, very well. And since we've been serving here together, we worked very closely together on NASA issues, which is very near and dear to her. But Charles Bolden, the NASA administrator, is from my congressional district, as is five other astronauts. And so we work very closely on these issues, and this is really hurting to a lot of us. My staff, as well as other staffs with leadership, are working very closely with her staff to make sure that constituents are served until she gets back with us. And we're just trying to ask people to really keep her in their thoughts and prayers, because we think that this issue and the way we react to it as a nation could very well define us going forward. And so we're trying to do what we can to maintain that kind of civility and concern and compassion for her and her constituents.
Congressman McCaul, what about you?
Well, it was surreal for all members, I think. But for those who knew or know Gabby, worked with her professionally, it was a personal blow. To watch the images on the screen, on the television, to see her, deeply painful. I served with her on 2 committees and still do, on the Foreign Affairs Committee and Science and Technology. I worked very closely with her on the NASA reauthorization bill to try to restore the human spaceflight program. And then on solar energy, she was so full of life about, hey, we come from 2 sunshine states, Texas and Arizona, and let's work together on a solar energy bill. And she was the type of member that really liked to work across the aisle. And that's always refreshing. And I think she really prided herself and does pride herself in being a very bipartisan member who can work effectively across the aisle, because that's what she believed, and I do too, that's what the American people want out of their representatives. So she was a real shining example, really a ray of sunshine in a place that can be very dark at times. And so I think we're all still trying to understand this. And I think, as was mentioned, I think how we handle this as members of Congress and how we handle the discourse is very important, because I know what was important to her. Her last race was very tough, and she personally talked to me about that. And I think it weighs on a member, but I think she wanted this place to be more, the tone to be less partisan, and rather a place that we could work together to get things done. And I think that's what she stands for, and I think for her, that's the best thing we can do.
Senator, what about you?
Well, Gabby is a good friend of mine, so the news was very personally devastating, and the story was horrific, something that you could never imagine happening to somebody who is such a kind and loving person who truly wants to serve the public. And the one thing about Gabby is she's a fighter, and she's an unbelievable woman. She has extraordinary talents, and I really believe in her. So I know that if anyone can pull through this, it's her. And I even talked to her husband a couple nights ago, and he was saying to me how he was telling the doctors that, wait and see, Gabby will be up and walking in 2 weeks. And I believe him, and I know that Gabby can do this because she's someone who has such an indomitable spirit and courage and strength. And that's what brought her to public service. She's somebody who wanted to always solve problems. She wants to be here, to be a voice for her district, to make a difference on issues like solar energy, on issues of defense. She and I had the great privilege of serving together on the Armed Services Committee when I was a House member. And I love the way Gabby looks at her job, because she looks at problems differently. And one of the things, a story about what she did on Armed Services that I like to tell is that she we were talking about an issue of military readiness and what we needed to strengthen our armed services. And a lot of folks were talking about different military machinery and equipment. But she talked about the people and the families. And she told a story about one of the doctors at her military base who who told her that men and women were being sent back into combat who were not emotionally or physically ready, and what we were doing about that, and what we were doing to provide for the troops and their families. So I know Gabby will pull through, and I do think that this discussion of how we conduct ourselves is important. I think making sure that we can respect one another, that we can have a national debate in a much more respectful way, and to really reject the politics of division and hate as leaders, I think is something that has to be a priority.
We'll talk obviously more about that in a moment, but Congressman, just tell me quickly about your reaction and to this whole event.
Well, as a new member, it's obviously very sobering, but I kind of come at it a little differently. I had been a district director for the Congressman Hoekstra who had preceded me, and we've lived through some very contentious times with him, flag burning amendments and impeachment, the anthrax scares. It's very sobering when you look at it from a staff side as well, and that's really who I was struck by. It made me look at my own staff very differently as well. So it's not just about us as members and our safety. It's about the safety of our staffers. It's about the safety of our constituents, because this is something that we all have done. You want to go out and engage and interact with your constituents. That's the nature of our government, and I think how we preserve that's going to be very important as well.
Does this make any of you worry about going out and speaking to your constituents and having public events like this?
No, I haven't talked to any member that is concerned or is going to retreat into a cocoon. We are representatives, and we are all, each and every one of us, regardless of party, determined to keep the meaning in that term representative. We all ran to be able to represent our constituents, to interact with the public, and, you know, Gabby Giffords is the consummate example of a representative, someone who loves being among her people, who, you know, went right back out after a very tough election and went in front of, out in front of Safeway, encouraged the people, whether they agree with her or disagree with her, to come and talk to her. I have been to Gabby's district, many times. She's been to mine. She's one of my closest friends. This is a person who has the sunniest disposition of anyone you'd meet, and who manages to find the good in everyone, even people who don't deserve it. So she, above all else, I know two things. One, that she absolutely would want us all to continue to interact and redouble our efforts to interact with our constituents. And two, really even above number one, that she would want us to use this opportunity to reestablish America as a shining example of democracy that we once were, that we practice our democracy with integrity, that we don't treat each other as enemies, and that we recognize that while we may be opponents and we differ on the issues, that we are all Americans and in this for the same reasons at the end of the day. And so even if the deranged individual who attacked her and killed the other victims did or did not do this to them as a result of hatred or violence or words, that's besides the point. We should use this as an opportunity to have a turning point in America.
And we'll talk about that more in a minute, because we have some poll results I want to ask you all about. But Congressman Guinta, I want to give you an opportunity. When you heard this, you're a freshman. Did you think, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? And I know that you all want to be one-on-one with your constituents. You all have no security when you're out and about, not even a police officer, nothing.
Well, I was still in Washington when this occurred, and when I had heard about the news, and my first reaction was pure shock. The fact that we had just been sworn in, that there is so much hope and optimism about this Congress and the awesome responsibility that we all share. And to think that a fellow colleague has been shot in doing something that we all feel is very important to the country and for the public discourse, being in the public, listening to your constituents. It's something that I think we all share as an important role that we play, because the office that I serve in is the people's office in the people's house. So I just happen to be here for a finite period of time. So I won't let this dissuade me from listening to my constituents, but it gives you great pause to think about what is truly important. I was privileged to read the Constitution immediately after Congresswoman Giffords, and it's interesting that she read the First Amendment. And I think that there has been a discourse about the First Amendment, and I think we all have a responsibility to say we are going to treat each other in a gentlemanly and a ladylike fashion, and that we may differ on philosophy, but that dialogue should be positive, it should be instructive, and it should demonstrate the will of the districts that we represent. And I hope that's what we take as members and colleagues from this incident.
Will any of you change the way you conduct yourself on a day-to-day basis back in your districts, talking to constituents, putting yourself in a similar position?
I had an interesting opportunity last night. I did my first telephone town hall meeting. What that is technology allows you to just call into the district. We had that preset. We were doing it last night and also tonight, as well as some live telephone town hall meetings. One of the questions I asked, you can do instant polling, clearly not scientific, but we asked, is this shooting make you more or less likely to come to a live telephone or a live town hall meeting? Because we want to gauge that as well. 80% of the respondents said they are more likely or would not shy away from it because of this. 11% that said that they would be more afraid to come. 9% said they weren't sure. But I thought that was very encouraging, having 80% of the people on that call say, hey, we want to assert ourselves also as constituents to come into that. Now, I think we all have to be smart. We all have to be smart about it and make sure that we notify local law enforcement and those types of things. But I was encouraged by that.
So nobody really is going to change their ways in the wake of this tragedy.
Let me say this. We are men and women of the people. We need to be fully accessible to them. We're to be held accountable. I have been concerned for a while. I mean, we have great security up here in the Capitol, which has been a target. Back home, as you mentioned, there really isn't any. And unfortunately, in this case, there wasn't. I had started a practice where I would at least notify local law enforcement and when I had public events. And I think that's a common sense security precaution that we should be taking because there is a lot of anger out there. And I think that is important. But I think it's important, as Debbie said, that we don't overreact to this. And I think you can strike a balance there where you can provide safety and security without not being accessible.
And I can't imagine that this won't be somewhere in the back of your minds when you are at these public events. I mean, obviously it won't dictate your actions, but if I were a member of Congress and I was appearing at a public event with a lot of people, what happened there certainly would be something that would be going through my mind.
Well, it's important that we strike a balance, like Mike said, but also not be cavalier about our security. At all of our town halls since I've been in Congress, and not every public event, but at town halls, particularly where the topic and the debate and discussion can get a little volatile, we have a police presence from the local jurisdiction. We have to keep in mind it's really not about us. I mean, we have to protect the constituents that come to these events. We have to protect our staff. We don't want an overwhelming presence. I mean, Monday, myself and two colleagues, Ted Deutsch and Frederica Wilson, had our local swearing-in ceremony outdoors on the steps of the federal courthouse and right in downtown Fort Lauderdale. And we held that event, had several hundred people still come, which was wonderful. But we did have a pretty significant security apparatus in place. And you know, I know they don't want us to discuss the details of security arrangements, but I think all of our local law enforcement, when we've reached out to them, have said that we need to be a bit more careful.
Let me ask you about this whole conversation that has unfolded about the tone of the political discourse in our country. According to the latest CBS poll conducted this week, 57% of respondents said they did not think the harsh political tone of recent campaigns contributed to these shootings. Given the fact that from what we know, at least at this point, given that this seems to be, from what we know so far, the work of a lone deranged gunman, is now the right time to really analyze and discuss the political discourse in our country?
I think so. Look, I lived through the 50s and the 60s. The Freedom Rides came through my hometown back in the 60s. I was a participant in the first sit-in in the state of South Carolina. In fact, I organized it. And I can tell you, I've seen those eyes that I saw on TV last night and this morning. And we cannot poo-poo that. We've got to really be very, very concerned about how we say things and the things that we do say and how that may impact people. Now, we've had a tremendous amount of assassinations in this country. I will never forget living through the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., of Robert Kennedy. I was a classroom teacher when John Kennedy was assassinated. I was standing before my class when the PA system came on to tell us what had happened to him. And I remember how the students reacted. And many of them reacted with tremendous anger. And so that's why I say the way that we respond to this is very, very important going forward, because the volatility in the atmosphere, it's there. I guess it was 18 months ago, August 2009, during that August break when we had all of these activities taking place at these town hall meetings, I made some adjustments then because my family members usually go to my town hall meetings with me. And so we started having a heightened presence of law enforcement. We started having our staff, my staff anyway, scattered among the participants. And I can tell you, notes that were passed to me by my staff during my town hall meeting were very, very helpful in how I reacted to questions that were asked. And so we have to, as Debbie says, we can't be cavalier about this. We've got to recognize this. And if I had not lived through it in the 60s, and let me say something about those numbers. 57% of the people say it had no impact. Well, a higher number than that said it had no impact during the assassination of King. A bigger number than that said that those of us who were students back in the 60s and sitting in, a bigger percentage of that said that we were wrong. And so I just asked the American people to be careful how we deal with these numbers, because I don't think the Civil Rights Act of 64 was wrong, or the Civil Rights Act of or the Voting Rights Act of 65, or the Fair Housing Law of 68. Were they wrong? But if you look at the polls, we were wrong.
We don't know what motivated this criminal. We may never know what motivated him to commit these heinous crimes. But what we do know is that the climate of debate has degraded so significantly, I believe, over the last decade that it has to end. And whether this is the wake-up call or this is just the reason we're debating this issue now, it's important that we have this debate, because I can tell you the politics of fear, the politics of hatred, the politics of divisiveness is very damaging to this country. It's damaging to who we are as Americans and damaging to our democracy. We must be able to have a national debate about issues that is conciliatory, that is respectful, that we can have differences. But I can tell you over the last several years, Katie, it has been reduced to something that politics should not tolerate. And we won't know why this particular crime was created, what was in this criminal's mind. But I can tell you it affects people. It affects different people different ways. And it is pervasive on every major issue. If you look at the volatility of issues around the country today, whether you're talking about gay rights, women's rights, civil liberties, immigration, the volatility is very high. And we as leaders must make the difference. We need, by our own actions, by the own language that we choose to use, how we treat each other, how we work together. And I can tell you from the last election, if any message is taken from the last election, is that the Americans everywhere want us to come here and get the people's business done. They want us to work together on solutions. They don't want Democratic ideas or Republican ideas. They just want good ideas. They want people who will solve this economic crisis and solve the issues of the day. And so I hope all of us who serve, can take this as a moment to reconsider how we ourselves act and do it better.
There's a wound inflicted upon the nation right now that I think needs to heal. And I think what would be a real tribute to Gabby would be to look at the public discourse and how can we make it more civil. I think we have an opportunity out of a tragic event to re-examine, as was discussed by the senator, how we debate up here. We can agree to disagree on things, and we do disagree on a lot of issues, and that's part of democracy. That's the founding fathers. But we can do it in a civil way with respect.
You have to lead by example. That's really important going forward, because you're going to have a lot of noise outside our process in Congress that is going to deny, maybe protest too much, maybe be defensive and say, that we're trying to stifle debate. None of us here are trying to stifle debate. We're going to vigorously advocate our views. But Gabby herself has said that we need to adopt a more civil tone and that the discourse needs to be more civil. And so we all need to use this as an opportunity, because there's no way that anyone could actually defend the way the discourse has gone over the last decade.
Do any of you feel this is not the right time, if in fact there's no evidence that this man was influenced or motivated by political rhetoric, that this may not be the right time to have this broader conversation? Does anyone feel that way?
Well, even if this tragic incident did not happen, I think we all have a responsibility to effectively lead and represent our constituents in a dignified way. It is this incident that is bringing this discussion to the forefront. But as a freshman, I wanted to join a body where I could do good with other members, regardless of your party affiliation. And I agree that we can have differences of opinion, but in a responsible way. Our country is made up of people with different ideas, different backgrounds, and we all as members reflect those different opinions and ideas. But we can do it in a way that says this institution is a very important one, and the dignity of it matters based on how we treat it and treat one another.
And Congressman, since you mentioned that sometimes numbers can be misleading, I also wanted to add that in our same poll, 49% believe the level of civility has declined in this country, and 52% say civility has declined specifically among members of Congress. Let me read you something that was in a video released by Sarah Palin this morning. She said, quote, "Acts of monstrous criminality stand on their own. They begin and end with the criminals who commit them, not collectively with all the citizens of a state, not with those who listen to talk radio, not with maps of swing districts used by both sides of the aisle, not with law-abiding citizens who respectfully exercise their First Amendment rights at campaign rallies, not with those who proudly voted in the last election." She preceded that statement with this. She said, I just want to give you kind of a sense of the tone of this video. President Reagan said, quote, "We must reject the idea that every time a law is broken, society is guilty rather than the lawbreaker. It is time to restore the American precept that each individual is accountable for his actions." What is your reaction to some of the things that were included in this video posted by Sarah Palin?
Well, I think Ronald Reagan had it right, that individuals do need to be responsible, but society also needs to reflect properly what's occurred in our past and how we can frame our future. This, I think, is about civility. It is about working on behalf of people, and we can do that in a way that makes Americans proud of not just their member of Congress, but the institution itself.
So you don't agree with her statement?
I'm not saying I don't agree with her statement. What I think this is about is an individual that we have yet to determine through the investigation why he did this, and hopefully we'll find that out in the coming weeks and months. But individuals do need to take responsibility for the things they do.
But she say these monstrous acts of monstrous criminality begin and end with the criminals who commit them, not collectively with all the citizens of a state.
I do not agree with that, and let me tell you why. I just finished reading Michelle Norris's book, The Grace of Silence, and it reminded me so much of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham City Jail when he admonished that we are going to be made to repent, not just for the vitriolic words and deeds of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. I do believe that the good people of America must speak out when we see these kinds of atmospheres being created. And that's all we're saying here. If it ended with this, have you ever heard of copycats? So it doesn't end with the person. Copycats chime in when they don't hear or experience interventions. So I just think that if we as a Congress and the good people of America were to speak out when we see these kinds of things, then it lessens the possibility that there will be a copycat. And I do believe that the justice's admonition on free speech, that it doesn't give us the right to yell fire in a crowded theater, ought to be kept in mind all the time.
Unfortunately, I think as you and I talked about before this, I mean, since this has occurred, we've seen elements in both sides of the aisle trying to attack each other as being part of the blame for what happened. And that's not the right tone. That's not the healing process for the nation. And I think, as Debbie said, we need to lead by example up here in the Congress first in terms of what is the right tone to lead by.
I saw the video of what Ms. Palin said, and the part that you didn't read was where she suggested that the advocacy that we are all making on behalf of more civil discourse is like we're trying to extract a blood libel, and that we're trying to tie this incident to words and actions of individuals. And, you know, let's remember that Gabby herself talked about just a few weeks ago the fact that individuals who shall remain nameless used violent images and words in her campaign, and she talked about how important it was that we dial it back, that we all recognize that we don't hate each other, that we simply disagree on the issues, and that a more civil tone is important. How anyone could argue with that, how someone could actually put together a video and defend violent conduct and violent words and violent symbolism in our political discourse is absolutely unimaginable.
Do you think that's what she was doing, defending violent rhetoric and imagery?
I think she has used violent imagery and violent language, and I think it appears to me that she's being somewhat defensive, yes.
At the same time, was it appropriate in the immediate aftermath of this event by some people to blame right-wing rhetoric?
But see, no one's blaming right-wing rhetoric. At least we are not blaming right-wing or left-wing. We are saying, and I think all of us together it's important to note, are saying that it's beside the point what the reasoning is. I mean, there is no reason when it comes to an attack like this, but that we all agree that the language and the tone and the tenor of our debate has gotten too intense, and that we need to lead by example, and that hopefully if we lead by example, then people outside the political process, the shock jocks, the other political leaders who do not serve with us, then hopefully we'll be able to put some pressure on them and hold them accountable to take a page from our book.
Let me read to you what the Congressman was referring to. She said, "Within hours of a tragedy unfolding, journalists and pundits should not manufacture a blood libel that serves only to incite the very hatred and violence they purport to condemn. That is reprehensible." Thoughts?
I disagree with her statements. I don't think it's helpful. And I think what we all need to do is exactly what we've been talking about, is to provide our own leadership and for Americans to demand more of us, to demand that civility, that substantive discussion, so that that's what people will respond to better. So they will look for representatives and leaders who do have that ability to cross party aisle, who do have the ability to come together, to work on consensus, to bring people together, and to work through the grassroots to move people forward in a way that's consistent with what Americans want everywhere. And so I think it's the wrong approach. I think it's the wrong message to take from this. And I think what you're seeing here on a bipartisan basis from leaders all across the Congress is that we will change the nature of the debate ourselves, Democrats and Republicans, because it's our obligation to lead this country better, more strongly, in a way that is more consensus building, to find solutions and to address problems. And so I don't think that approach is helpful.
And I think there was a bit of a rush to judgment as to who this individual is. We still don't know completely. And I think there was an attempt, at least, to put it on one side, you know, and politicizing this event to me is it's just apprehensible. We cannot politicize this event. And my concern is that right off the bat that the arrows are starting to fly, and you see it on both sides of the aisle, and that I think is a great disappointment, and that's what we have to change up here.
You know, I think we all will agree that the pendulum goes back and forth. And I feel compelled for us to mention that I saw it go all the way to the left. I saw attempts made on the life of Ronald Reagan, on the life, 2 attempts on President Ford, and it was coming from the left. And so it does happen on both sides, but I don't think, and I believe if you go back, nobody was paying much attention to me back in those days, but I spoke out against what happened to Ronald Reagan and to Ford. And I think it's imperative that we speak out against these kinds of things, irrespective of who may be the subject of them.
Right.
So it goes back and forth, and we are now seeing it coming from the other side, just like we saw it come from the left back during those days.
I was just going to say, I think Charles Krautheimer in the Washington Post today kind of pointed this out. You know, this was not political behavior on the part of the shooter. And unlike, you know, possibly the assassination of Dr. King, and I mean, in a town where Abraham Lincoln is memorialized, you could point to those as political. Those were political statements as to what was happening in the day. I think this shooting, at least what we see so far, pretty clearly is not politically motivated somehow, and I think that goes to the point that maybe Mike was making. You know, we don't. There's no particular party or philosophy that's attached to this. It appears to be a deranged person who is doing that, and those terrible things are going to happen. I don't think it's going to stop us from having a vigorous philosophical disagreement at times with the direction or the function of government. It should happen that way. We just need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's respectful and obviously not harmful.
It was law enforcement in Arizona that made that first statement. It was law enforcement that said the rhetoric had become too heated. So this was a determination by those who are in charge of public safety. So it's not that this is, I think, that is being taken out of context, that it's not somehow related. It may not have anything to do with this criminal, as we said. We may never know what motivated him. But for law enforcement to make this deduction immediately, he knows what kinds of threats are taking place in the community. He knows the level of debate in that community, and he sees it as a risk. So I think we have to give law enforcement the credibility that is due, that they know what this kind of hate speech does and how it creates animosity in a community and may have a different impact in someone who's not mentally stable or someone who's coming from a different perspective than we might otherwise think. And I just think that if we can take this lesson and use it to change how we behave personally and take it as a way to be better than we are, then I think that is an important lesson to learn.
You and Kirsten are right. We have to be very careful about making any pronouncements right now because we don't know what the motivation. There are documents that were found. He definitely hated her. We know that, and that bore out in what he did to her. But I mean, I've been to southern Arizona, to Gabby's district, and the whole country has been riveted over the last year on the political climate and environment in Arizona as a result of some of the decisions that their government has made. So, I mean, there's no question that the environment there politically is very charged, very hot, and that the words and symbolism that have been used anywhere needs to be ratcheted back so that we can engage in a discourse that is more productive and sets a better example than we have been.
Congressman?
Well, we also have a responsibility to allow local law enforcement and law enforcement that's national, that's involved, to complete their investigation and provide all of the facts before, in these immediate days, before we all jump to conclusions. And I think, as an aside, the Congress is handling this in an appropriate way, where we are taking pause from the work of the country. We recognize that this is a heinous act, and that's not in a partisan way. That's in a more familial, collegial way, that we're all shocked and we're outraged that this could happen, not just to a member of Congress, but to anybody in our country. So let's take a step back. Let's make sure this investigation is completed efficiently, and then let's all have a long-term dialogue about how we can be more effective in working together and being more collegial, because that in and of itself, I think, sets a better tone for America.
I think there's been a general coarsening of society in political realm or outside the political realm. You look at the stuff that kids are watching on TV, the games that they're playing on the internet, all those different things. And that's a concern that I have had. And that's not necessarily the responsibility of the government. That's the responsibility of me as a parent as well. And I know there's a number of other parents sitting right here. We've got to make sure that we are careful what input is going into our kids, and then monitoring their reactions as we teach them what the proper way is. I think that then goes to the point of our kids are watching, I can tell you, my kids are watching me specifically. They're watching this body as a whole. They're watching the process that we're going through. And these might be kids that are involved sort of politically right now, but it happens no matter what the realm is in our life. And we've got to all be conscious of that, whether it's us politically or everybody out there watching this.
Before I served here, I was a mayor, and my wife always used to tell me, be careful how you act and conduct yourself on TV. You never know when your kids may be watching. And she put it in the context of being a father. And that always stuck with me. And that's the way I want to try to conduct myself, whether it's in public or in private. And I think we all have kids. We talked about it before we started this interview. And to have that discourse in such a fashion where I look at somebody, a colleague, as a parent, as a mother, as a father, we're all living in lives where we want to serve. We might be in the public eye. But, as the senator said before, she doesn't have necessarily a clean suit in her closet because she's a mother first, if I could say that on TV.
We need a little more context for that.
Wow. You have to explain that.
I understand.
More like the peanut butter and jam on my shoulder before I go out.
But I used to go to the office in the same fashion, and I would have to sort of clean myself up because I was being a dad. So if we can look at our service in that context, I think that we'd be serving better.
And I do mean, the speaker talked about in his address the scars and the scars that need to heal. And then this tragic event happens. We'll be leaving this interview to speak on the House floor in support of a resolution honoring the victims. There is a tone up here, and it's very palpable in Washington right now on both sides of the aisle when we see each other, that this happened to one of us, to a member. And an attack on one is an attack on all. And so there is a sense of solidarity, I think, on this issue and on a new opportunity to move forward in a positive direction.
Just as a mom, and I want to just share that the impact on our children is something that we have to keep first and foremost. It's not always the first thing that people think about, but my 11-year-old daughter, and Gabby's and my family are very close. My kids know her, know her husband and his kids. After my daughter heard that, Gabby had been shot, the first thing she asked me was, Mommy, are you going to get shot? Does that mean you're going to get shot? And then I, did my best to reassure her, tell her, no, Mommy takes precautions. You've been to my meetings. We have, we take steps to make sure that we're all safe. But then the next thing she said to me was, and this is where you don't realize how closely they're watching, but Mommy, Florida's going to pass an immigration law like Arizona, and then people are going to be mad at you. they're paying attention. The civil discourse is very important because it's not just adults that this permeates. It's our children, and then the next generation has to grow up following our example.
Congressman Clyburn, after this incident, you said, quote, "It seems like this gentleman was not satisfied with the way the election turned out." And you blame candidates like Sharon Engel for using incendiary language like finding Second Amendment remedies during her campaign. Do you think you spoke too soon?
No, I don't. Gabby predicted something like this. She, in her own words, said to us a few months ago, in pointing out some of the symbolism, and words are symbols. And I think that we are responsible for what we say and the way we say it. And I do believe that using that kind of rhetoric in no way enhances the politics of this country. And so I don't feel that I spoke too soon at all, because I have been saying for months that we need to cool it. In fact, I've been saying that for a long time, because I've experienced this. You know, I've lived through this, and I know that I could feel that this thing was just getting overly heated.
Sharon Engel issued a statement today, and in it she said, inappropriately attributing blame of a singular tragedy to achieve a political agenda is contrary to civil discourse and is a media ploy to which I refuse to belong.
Well, all I will say to that is, any one incident, then I wouldn't have a word to say. But when you see it happening, and I read my mail, or I used to, the faxes that have come into my office, the phone calls that have come to my office, the stuff that show up in the blogosphere, this stuff is very, very heated. As recent as this morning, my staff shared with me stuff that's coming into our office. Now, this stuff is horrible. It is horrible. And all I'm saying is, some weak-minded person going onto the internet, it could very well see in this rhetoric martyrdom. That's what I was saying. And that could very well be the case here. And just because we don't think it has anything to do with it, or won't admit that it has anything to do with it, doesn't mean that it doesn't.
The attacks on the internet are vicious, not just against Democrats, but against Republicans as well. And it's ratcheted way up. Our vernacular that we've been talking about lately, you're targeted, right? I was targeted at one time. I talked to Gabby about, gee, you're targeted. That must be very difficult. I've had friends of mine, we've all lost friends that have not gotten reelected, but the idea of you're targeted, you're in the bullseye. Now that's a term used on both sides of the aisle. And maybe that's the kind of thing that does need to change.
I know that FBI Director Robert Mueller said that the FBI is looking into whether Loeffner was egged on by extremist groups on the internet. Do you think the internet is feeding into the anger and potentially psychotic, violent behavior?
Absolutely. There's no question in my mind that that's what's going on here. We said something earlier. I often think about the way I was taught as a child. I remember my dad had said to me one time, son, the first sign of a good education is good manners. I have never forgotten that. And I may talk about political issues, and I feel very strongly about them. Growing up in South Carolina, one can imagine that I have very strong feelings about school integration, about employment opportunities, educational opportunities. I have very strong feelings about that. But you have never heard me direct anything at anybody personally, because I don't feel that that's necessary in order to carry an idea or a good argument. But we've gotten to the point where these things are being personalized in such a way that it would cause a weak-minded person to say, no, that's the way I feel about that person. And that person gets targeted in the person's mind, or someone zeroes in on. I mean, this guy wasn't hating Gabby Giffords because she was a citizen of Tucson, Arizona. I mean, what caused him to focus on her? I believe it's because of her public positions and the fact that she is a public figure. She still is. And so I think that what caused him to zero in on her is something we all should be concerned about, because we're all public figures. And if people go onto the internet, read something that's said about you, and begin to internalize that, then who knows what goes on in the minds of a weak-minded person. So that's all I've said about this, and I really believe very strongly that the internet can be a bad place.
It's freedom of speech, but the fact is there's no way to really stop it on the internet. But the media has a responsibility as well. I believe the media has gotten very polarized in some levels in terms of polarizing the debate in the argument up here in Washington. And I think we all have a responsibility. I think, as Debbie mentioned, we have to lead by example, but so do the American people, and so does the media.
We all support the First Amendment, and so going in and regulating what you can say on the internet is not the path we want to travel down. But conduct on the internet and finding a way to assist people in learning the appropriate conduct on the internet is important. There's a couple of different bills that have been floating around in the Senate and the House. I'm a sponsor of the AWARE Act, which is legislation that would help teachers, students, and parents learn how to be safe online and learn how to interact online. I mean, the vulgar language and things that are said about people, whether it's elected officials or even the banter back and forth in texting between our kids and Facebook. I mean, and the fact that spelling doesn't matter. I mean, just the conduct. Not to be an English teacher.
There are risks too. I mean, one of the things that we've been working on is online bullying, the inciting of violence, the inciting of criminal activity, the use of the internet as criminal conduct itself. I focus a lot of times on terrorism, on cyber terrorism, cybercrime. So there's a lot of work that we as legislators can do to address the crimes that get generated through internet behavior, whether it's inciting violence, inciting crime, or creating bullying for our children. There's also the issue of just keeping our children safe from stalkers and criminals who are trying to target them, and that's another area of our interest that we're working on right now.
Kirsten and I have worked on this together. That's why we're finishing each other's sentences. But I passed the Protect Our Children Act with Vice President Biden when he was in the Senate, and it was designed to create an online and internet crimes against children army. Because there's 500,000 known individuals transmitting child pornography on the internet. Those are crime scene photos. Those are kids who are being victimized, and they're able to be more easily victimized because of the internet.
But is there a way of ratcheting down the debate online, which seems to feed into the whole tenor of the times? People have what amounts to digital fistfights on a regular basis. If you read the comment section after any article, it quickly devolves into insults and attacks. But how do you control that?
Well, what we're working on is defining criminal activity that takes place on the internet.
Well, that's not criminal activity.
Understood. But once you begin to define behavior that is out of bounds, whether it's online bullying, whether it's cybercrime or cyber terrorism, whether it's attacking or attracting or trying to manipulate children, those are things that we can begin to define. So there will begin to be a realization by Americans that there is a line that cannot be crossed, and there is such thing as criminal activity. And so if we can begin to define what's certainly out of bounds, there hopefully can be a discourse about what is not helpful and things that can actually gravitate towards incitement of violence.
I think it starts in school. It has to start in school, because I think most teachers would admit to you that they really don't know how to teach kids about internet conduct and internet safety, and we need to make sure that they have the tools so that we're growing up kids to do that.
Let me ask you two more questions, because you have to leave, and I'm sure you all do, so thank you. But you all say that you have to set an example, but with all due respect, if you watch any political campaign and you watch these ads that basically disparage, malign, and misrepresent people on a regular basis, I mean, shouldn't you be held accountable for that?
Hey, Katie, I want to address that a little bit, because I had a unique opportunity in my district. I had a 7-way primary and a relatively conservative district, so it was a pretty strong Republican district. I didn't once talk about any of my opponents, my Republican opponents in the primary or my Democrat opponent in the general election.
You're
I talked about me. I am, but here was the interesting reaction. When I was going to door, because Michigan, we had very contentious elections going on for governor, every single state House seat, every single state Senate seat, congressional seats were up. People were collecting their mail, and I would go door to door and I would have people say, we're looking, we're watching, we're getting everybody's mail. We like what you have to say, because you're not doing that. It really is up to the American people also to say, we're not going to let this kind of, political speech
I've always
work.
A positive campaign on the issues of the American people. You'd be surprised how much they like that kind of campaign.
Then why don't more people do it?
Consultants.
Because the public responds to the negativity.
The negativity
Absolutely.
works. That's
And
what
you
they
know-
say.
And even when we run positive campaigns, what we have allowed now is for unlimited amount of money to now be spent by third-party groups out there that do, in fact, go very negative. The kind of stuff that I saw said about John Spratt in this past election was just absolutely beyond the pale. And then the candidate says, well, that's not me.
And
But,
there's no accountability in that unlimited spending right now. One of the bills we desperately tried to pass was at the end of that ad, I want to know who's paying for that television ad. Hi, I'm Joe, CEO, and I approve this ad. Or hi, I'm Joe, donor, and I approve this ad. Because without disclosure, the American people don't know how to discount who's saying that message.
You two are very close personal friends with Congresswoman Giffords. What do you think what do you think Congresswoman Giffords would think of the debate that has unfolded in this country in the aftermath of these shootings?
Oh, I'm positive that she will want a debate to move forward just like the one that we're all advocating, which is that we have to dial it back. She said that herself. We have to stop using violent imagery and graphics in our communication. We have to establish a more moderate and civil tone and realize, just like Gabby conducts herself every day, that there is some good in everyone, and that we need to look for that good and realize that we're all in this for the right reason and the same reason, even when we disagree.
And I do think Gabby herself has shown extraordinary leadership on this issue. And in thinking of Reverend King, one time he said that sometimes the greatest of the darkness is the only time that you can see the stars. And what I take from that statement is that in these dark times, when we see so much violence and crime and difficulty and challenge, that what it does create is that opportunity for great lightness and great leadership, and for people to do good things and to show the goodwill that humanity actually has. And so I'm hoping that from this awful, horrific event, that the bright light that we will see is new leadership, a new level of discourse, and people actually coming together to do good things for America.
She always talked about, I'm from the Sunshine State of Arizona, and that really kind of epitomizes her personality, her spirit. And I think, well, she's passionate and tough. But I think that's the best tribute we could pay to her, is to try to lead by example, try to bring this Congress together. We're not going to agree on everything, but let's change the tone and civility here. I think that's what she would want. And I think it's very disappointing to see the politicization of this process. This was not a political event. It was a politician who was unfortunately shot. But it opens up a new opportunity for us to heal these wounds.